So good morning, everyone, or good night, depends on where you are. I'm Constance. I'm the head of trade competitiveness and business diplomacy at the National Confederation of Industry. And it's a pleasure. I will be moderating this panel organized by GBC. So GBC is a global business coalition that brings together leading business associations from major world economies from 14 countries. And GBC purpose is to advocate for policies and multilateral solutions that improve the business environment and that also support sustainable economic growth. So the GBC, the coalition, focuses on helping members associations to share intelligence, access decision makers, and to coordinate national and international advocacy campaigns that aim at building consensus and developing common positions on several and a wide number of topics that are critical for enterprises. So in our panel today, I have 4 distinguished colleagues and speakers that represent members of GBC, or associations that work very close. So let me just quickly introduce them that are here with us. Laurent Cher, President for MEDEF Trade Negotiations Committee and Global Public Affairs VP at Pernod Ricard. Jörg Hottermel, Head of the Department of Energy, Climate Protection and Raw Materials, German Chemical Industries and Associations. Bilur Barlin, Managing Director at Solmas Freight Customs and Logistics from TUSIAD, the Turkish Industry and Business Associations, and Alik Angaladian, Director of Trade and Economic Affairs at the Canadian Steel Producers Associations. So before passing the floor to my colleagues, I would just like to share with you a quick overview on the topics and issues that we intend to tackle in this 1 hour of the panel. So as a global business federation, GBC members think that sustainability is a power driver for resilience and the world needs after this economic crisis. So with this in mind, GBC decided to organize this session to give the floor to industry representatives. So we invited them to review major challenges and advantages of conciliating trade and environment, protecting and reducing carbon footprint, and also for them to illustrate how companies can manufacture and trade responsibly. And also to make concrete proposals and thought insights for regulatory and policy principles that should be considered when thinking on this type of measures that have an interlinkage between trade and environment, as is the case for the carbon adjustment mechanism. So the link between trade and environment protection is not new. Economic growth resulting from trade expansion can have obvious direct impacts on the environment, but at the same time, increased trade can, by supporting economic growth and social welfare, contribute to a greater capacity to manage environment more effectively. So sound environmental policies and institutional frameworks are needed at different levels, local, regionally, nationally, internationally, and business organizations as ours support these policies. Probably one of the most relevant recent initiatives in this area that are clearly showing this interlinkage between trade and environment is happening at the EU level. So in December, the EU launched the Green Deal. It's a new guideline to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by 55% by 2030 and to achieve a climate neutrality. So as part of that European Green Deal, the European Commission has proposed a carbon adjustment mechanism that will require importers to purchase carbon emission certificates for inputs that the European Union determines are not produced under emission standards similar or equivalent to those of the EU. So the main aim of this measure objective is to reduce the risk of the well-known carbon leakage challenge, with companies moving production from Europe to areas with less stringent environmental regulations, let's say. So sectors that are currently so far covered in this proposal go from iron, steel, aluminum, cement, fertilizers, electricity, but probably new sectors could be included. So it also foresees different phases of implementation, a transitory and a regular phase. And even more, other countries are probably moving in a similar direction. We have seen movements in that direction, either on the US at the Congress, Canada with the first phase of a public consultation, and much more recently, the UK also with a consultation. So the design of those carbon adjustment mechanism measures, it's a very early stage. It's early to say how exactly they're going to work and be implemented, but we cannot really see that type of measure raises some issues, either on the right balance between traditional trade rules and environmental objectives, the right balance between purely environmental measures on the one hand and measures that are aimed at addressing competitiveness of domestic industry, consistency with the multilateral rules, both either by on the WTO level or the Paris Agreement, and even more impact issues that are related to the impacts on the company's adaptations to those mechanisms. So in a certain way, those carbon adjustments aim to respond to a global environmental objective and challenge, which is extremely relevant for the business. But at the same time, more and more those measures are currently being designed or thought on a unilateral, isolated way, and with considerable impacts on the trade field. So keeping this in mind, the main aim that our panel has today is to focus on what are those initial business perspectives from different sectors, countries. We have European representatives, third country representatives today, and different sectors in our panel, so that we can start looking into the business perspectives. So there's a whole technical discussions on the impacts at WTO trade environment legal norms. But here today, we would like to also to focus more on how this impacts on a daily basis for companies that are operating either within the EU market or from the third market perspectives. So I would like to start giving the floor with this quick overview on the panel to my colleague Laurent Cher, so that he can share with us his companies, MEDEF, and also with MEDEF Chappelle, what are his view on these challenges, either on the broad perspective of trade and environment, how to combine those two high priorities and specific measures that are related to that. Laurent, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Constanza. It's a privilege to be speaking at the WTO Public Forum and with such a great group of knowledgeable people from business. So I'm wearing two hats today. So I'm going to be sharing basically the perspective of MEDEF, which is a French business confederation, and illustrating with examples drawn from my own company's practical journey environment. The basic point that we feel within French business is that we don't need to say it's trade or the environment. We can actually combine the two. They're not antagonistic to each other. You can achieve a high level or higher level of environmental preservation while having international supply chains and trade intensive economic growth. And from my company's perspective, so we're doing manufacturing and exporting wines and distilled spirits. So for instance, we do cognac in France. 99% of such cognac is exported. We do also, beyond the boundaries of France, we also do whiskey in Ireland. 96% of this is exported. And in fact, this means that you're manufacturing in one area and exporting to the rest of the world. So it sort of places a duty on you as a manufacturer to be both preserving the environment where you make, but also the environment on how you export and where you sell. So it means that you need to have a holistic view of how you do efforts to preserve the environment without necessarily waiting for the government to tell you how to do it. So give a couple of examples of what we try to do. We try to reduce water usage. We've reduced by 20%. We hope to reduce another 20% in the next 10 years. We're trying to make all our packaging recyclable by at least 2025, and to make sure then that in the countries where we operate, where we sell the glass, because our products are packaged in glass, and not just recyclable, but also recycled. So we're hoping to achieve at least 50% of recycling of all our packaging by 2025. So we're looking at manufacturing, looking at sales. In fact, manufacturing also means that in our specific business, we're talking about taking agricultural crops, transforming them into a liquid, finished product that people then can enjoy. Well, this means that we have a duty to biodiversity. We need, and it's in our vested interest that we don't do such an extensive agricultural practice in our terroir, on the soils in the place where we make, that we actually end up impoverishing the soils. It's in our vested interest to ensure that we are careful about using pesticides, and we're trying to get rid of them wherever we can. It's in our vested interest to ensure that we don't, that the farmers that work with us in those various areas, growing corn, growing wheat, growing grapes, do actually take care of the land. Because if we exhaust the land, won't be able to manufacture and to export. So again, it's not because we manufacture for export purposes that we can't have a duty. And on carbon, basically, whether there's a CBAM or not in Europe or elsewhere, for my company, journey is clear. Investors expect us, and the public, our consumers, expect us to reduce our carbon footprint. We've reduced it by already a third so far, and we expect to be net zero by 2030 in our own operations, which means our own manufacturing. The trick will, of course, to be doing also in scope 3 emissions to be reducing it as much as we can. So business can be green, and honestly, protectionism is not going to help greening the business. If anything, if you want to continue exports to be sustainable in the two senses of the word, you have to be particularly careful. I would take an example from one of the places which is the most remote from any other place in the world, New Zealand. It's a country which is very far from most of its export markets. The New Zealand wine industry started its sustainability strategy in '95, when nobody even knew what sustainability meant, because precisely they had a clear understanding that for their product to be, let's say, to be acceptable around the world, they needed to reduce the level of fertilizers, they needed to use green energy so that they would be as green as possible. Because if you end up in a given market to shut down the border and to say that, okay, foreign products are not welcome because they're bad for the environment, well, how do you know? Because it's not because a product is imported that it doesn't have high energy efficiency. Not because a product is imported that it's not recyclable. And sometimes in a given market, and the New Zealand wine did that, your imported product is actually more sustainable than a domestic product, which hasn't done all the efforts which are needed in terms of reducing carbon, reducing waste, etc. So I think government should help accompany this transition for businesses. And what matters really for them to protect the environment is to ensure that the domestic policies to protect the environment are good, and protectionism and basically using it as the environment as a pretext to shut down borders is probably not going to help. And it's interesting to see that the international trade component needs to be factored into these domestic policies. Give an example: when a given government decides recycling and say that you have to return the empty bottle back to the supermarket for it to be refilled, I'm sorry, it doesn't work. Because my bottle of cognac that is sold in China is not going to go back to France to be refilled. It's crazy. So you have to find ways to, but you can find ways actually in China or in the United States where a French product is sold to ensure that such product is recycled without necessarily going to solutions which actually increase the carbon footprint of such bottle, sending the bottle back to France to be refilled. So I think business can play a key role, and governments can help us on this journey in a smart way. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Laurent. I think you made two very interesting points. One linked to not looking into as antagonistic areas or policies, and the role that government has in terms of transitioning. And there it's important to bear in mind that not all the countries have the same conditions to do this transition. So let me please give the floor to our second speaker, Jörg Hottermann from the Chemical German Industry Association, so that he can bring the perspective of the German sector of chemicals and how this can impact into the operations. We know chemicals are not included, not yet, but fertilizers are there. So this brings us also to look into the inputs of the supply chain. Please, Jörg, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Constanza. The chemical industry is included already in the new approach. It's limited, but the chemical industry is already in the system. We partly with the fertilizers. Fertilizer is a chemical product at the end of the day. But mainly also with ammonia and nitric acid, which are raw materials for the fertilizers at the end. Yeah, here we have the whole value chain, yeah, from ammonia and fertilizers and ammonia, nitric acid, and fertilizers in the system already. And and ammonia and nitric acid is also a unique, a very important, chemicals for a lot of different processes in the chemical industry. It's not only for the fertilizers; it's a huge range of processes which need ammonia or nitric acid. Yeah, and therefore the chemical industry is more in the system than it appears only with these three different chemicals. Yeah, but let me explain why how we are affected from the system. Our perspective is that at the end of the day, such a system brings more risks for us than really the carbon leakage protection, which is foreseen from the European Commission. Let's say, let's explain why. The connection with the CBAM with the European emissions trading system, in which we are with all our processes as chemical industry, yeah, is at the end of the day the big problem. Yeah, of course, there is a possibility to bring a certain form of carbon leakage protection with the CBAM, yeah, because you can, of course, protect the European production. And the production in Europe, you can protect it by make the imports more expensive. Yeah, of course. But what the system itself does not protect the exports. And as chemical industry in Europe or in Germany and in Europe, we are strongly export oriented. Yeah, we have a lot of exports outside of Europe, and with the combination or with the link of the CBAM with the emissions trading system and cutting the carbon leakage protection of the ETS system, of the emissions trading system, yeah, and only using the CBAM as a carbon leakage protection instrument, yeah, we have, of course, problems with our exports, because the exports will be in the same competition situation like before the CBAM system, but the exports are not protected. Yeah? And that's one problem. And second problem is, and here the fact that ammonia and nitric acid is a raw material for a little for a lot of other processes in the chemical industry, which will become more expensive, which will increase the production costs in the value chain of the chemical industry. Yeah, and the other chemicals in the value chain of the chemical industry are not protected by CBAMs. Yeah, because only nitric acid and ammonia is in the system. Yeah, which will become more expensive, which will increase the costs of the value chain. Yeah, and there is also no alternative to import the nitric acid and the ammonia, because here we have the CBAM. It's also more expensive, and at the end of the day, the value chain will be more expensive, and the value chain is also in an international competition. That's a problem. Huh? At the end of the day, the exports are not really protected, and the chemicals in the value chain, in the further value chain of the chemical industry, are also not protected, and therefore we have a problem with this CBAM system. Yeah, we cannot. It can be solved, this problem, by compensating the exports, but everyone you talk with about this fact says that this will never be WTO compatible. Yeah, we cannot compensate for the exports. Yeah? At the end of the day, and therefore we have no solution for the exports and for the value chain. Here we only could include the whole value chain into the CBAM system. That would solve the problem of the value chain. But with the already existing bureaucracy, with the system we already have, with these two or three chemicals, we do not see really a system at the end of the day which would include all the different 30,000, 50,000 chemicals we are producing and which we are selling into the world. That would be the problem. At the end of the day, let's summarize. We have great doubts that the approach of the EU Commission brings us more benefits and more carbon leakage protection than the system we have at the moment. The emissions trading system, the free allowances, and the compensation for the electricity price and all these things. Yeah, we have great doubts that this system will bring us will bring us in a better situation, in a better carbon leakage protection. Okay.
Thank you very much, Jörg, for this quick initial comments on your sector and the impact of the raw materials. So now I would like to give the floor to our third speaker, Bilur Barlin from TUSIA, Turkish company, a Turkish company. Turkey is one of the countries that is within the top rank of the possible negative impacts of such a system. So we would like to hear from your sector's perspective of logistics, but also in terms of the Turkish business perspective on this issue. Please, Bilur.
Yes, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm so happy that the word sustainability is being used for every aspect of our lives now. We really need the world, the environment, the businesses, the education and welfare systems to be sustainable. And the whole world agrees that sustainability is a real term only if it's connected with the environment's well-being maintenance. With the climate change going on around the world, affecting the animals' migration routes and causing illnesses to be transported, raising domestic and international immigration issues with the reality of hunger, drought, and decrease in agricultural capabilities, and forcing some countries to take drastic measures as to introduce day zero. It is always very difficult to induce a new strategy and policy to the common ground, but this time we need to move faster. We've realized that our resources are not infinite, and if we want to achieve sustainability in anything, we first have to start with the environment. So a united goal requires a united policy. The 2 points we would like to emphasize is that this has to be a collective action. We cannot succeed if we leave anyone behind. And the second is all policies should be WTO compliant. Turkey has always been a geographically strategic country. We know we are placed in the middle of 3 historical continents that are very much in trading business with each other, which brings in dynamics like supply chain, logistics, manufacturing, all that consume a lot of natural resources and energy. Sustainable trade should mean sustainable growth, which requires transparency and accountability. As TUSIAD, with the signing of Paris Climate Accords in 2017, we approved the first and unique climate-based position paper at our board and adopted the Paris Climate Accords as our strategic priority. Since then, we've been working with the representatives of all industries of Turkey to support our government with our collective views to be a part of this agreement. We believe in the need of a concrete roadmap to ensure the policy consistency to underline carbon neutral targets for 2050. Therefore, to hear the news of our authorities to be receiving the Paris Climate Accord next month at the Council for approval is a great joy. So in a global world for collective action, first, we need to make sure that the dialogue mechanism is strong and inclusive when coming up with a global policy. This policy must be general, therefore WTO compliant. All countries must create a fund to support the businesses to transform their business models into a more sustainable structure. The taxes to be collected in relation with carbon emissions should be the basis of this fund. Therefore, we believe the taxes should be local taxes. Sometimes local funds will not be enough, and international funds should direct to support local businesses in their transformation journeys. The second most important aspect is that these funds should be distributed to businesses in a fair calculation. We should not forget that the beneficiaries are all of us. Every action will create a chain reaction. Third, we need to continue with international and national awareness and training campaigns to have the contribution and support of the people. The people, the end users, the end buyers will decide which products to buy and use. When they believe that their collective actions will make a difference in the world's climate change and sustainability future, they will make the right choice and will force the brands and manufacturers to transform eventually. Therefore, when CBAM is being introduced by our biggest trade partner as a part of the customs union, we would like to be included in calculation and application discussions. Turkey is working very hard to be in compliance with EU laws and regulations. And with our geographically strategic location, we're trying to be a better supplier with higher standards and close proximity. Any fund as a result of CBAM taxation should support the Turkish businesses to transform their businesses to a more sustainable business model. Turkey is still an emergent market economy and will definitely need support from its trade partners. Looking forward, we believe that the Green Deal should be a crucial part of the customs union, which should be revised, modernized as soon as possible to be in parallel with global actions. I still have to talk about the logistics perspective, but maybe later.
Please go ahead, please.
Okay, well, logistics is one of the industries that produce the most carbon emissions. And looking at sustainable trade from a logistics point of view, I believe it should start with a smart planning of the supply chain management. As a logistics community, we also face some challenges on top of the ones that I've mentioned before. There are over like 5,000 container ships going around the world at the moment. There are studies and R&Ds being conducted to transform these ships into LNG or hydrogen-based engines and even electric engines. However, it is not possible to convert the current engines into these systems. Therefore, all these ships will need to be rebuilt, and it takes about 1 to 3 years to build a new ship based on its size. And what will we do with all the old ships? I'm sure you've realized during the pandemic when cruise ships were parked at the ports, we have witnessed some of them decaying in water, which eventually causes pollution. And if we're able to pull them out of the water, then what are we going to do with all that scrap? Well, by the way, there are some R&D projects on vessel spare parts to be printed on the vessel as it sails by a 3D printer, which I think is a brilliant idea to avoid logistics costs. However, there's the challenge of the size of the printer versus the size of the spare part and the raw materials to be used in the printer. For about 15 million of trucks carrying cargo around the world, I don't know if it gets easier than sea freight. They will need to be replaced as well. And some of the challenges we're facing in Turkey regarding these trucks are, first of all, the worth of logistics is not highly appreciated. Everyone's looking for a cheap solution to keep the logistics cost as low as possible. There are so many of these trucks to be renewed with a more green engine. The revenue does not actually cover the investment. The companies who want to invest in modern trucks would like to invest in electric engines, but the ranges are very low and the infrastructure is not well developed to help them reach their destinations in required transit times, and it is very expensive. We still do not know how logistics will be taxed by within CBAM, and our concern is that this will be reflected on the logistics industry as a cost rather than as an incentive mechanism for green investment. I would like to give some examples on how we are trying to manage our green strategy as Solmas. So we started to publish a sustainability report to raise awareness within Solmas and to give some insight to our employees on the projects we managed to achieve carbon net and what each and every one of us may do to contribute individually. We came up with a calculation of the primary resources we consume in transportation and warehousing. And this year we're starting to give each of the head of the business unit in KPI responsibilities to lower the consumption of carbon emissions and also natural resources, and also maybe add some of the compensation costs to their budgets as well. We've been looking into renewable energy investments, but they're very expensive. Therefore, we decided to start with supporting the renewable energy production and contributed to IREC certifications for the amount of electricity we consume within a year. For the fuel usage, we try to carbon offset by helping out with plantation of trees. All the used packaging materials used at the warehouses, we give into recycling companies. For the rest of the waste, we made arrangements with special companies to pick them up from our locations so that they will be handled in an environment-friendly way. We use digital archive for any documents and we try to manage all our operations digitally. However, unfortunately, we still have a lot of paperwork that we have to print and circulate around our clients and customs administrations. Once the customs and logistics authorities go fully digital and not require printed documents, then we believe the effect will be both on paper and fuel consumption. I think that's it for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bilur, for your two comments on those two aspects. Before please passing the floor to Alec, just wanted to remind you, for those that will have an interest to raise questions, please, you can do it. We will have some time after this third round to raise questions from the participants. Please, Alec, the floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. Thank you for having me today to speak to you, and thanks to the GBC for this invitation. I am based in Ottawa, and it's very early in the morning, so you're probably hearing my morning voice a little bit at the moment too. I think my colleagues touched on some interesting points, and from an industry, I'm from the Canadian Steel Producers Association, an industry that is captured in the EU conversations and in the early stages of a conversation with the Canadian government on carbon border adjustment. I thought to set the context for our comments on the border carbon adjustments, I'll step through quickly at a very high level Canada's climate plan, and then orient how the Canadian steel producers are approaching this before talking about what we would like to see in border and carbon adjustments, which have been developed through discussions with other emission intensive trade exposed sectors, and then maybe potentially touch a little bit on the important role the WTO can play on this front. As mentioned, my colleagues have brought that point up, and it would be remiss for us not to have a quick discussion on that. So just to give you an idea about Canada's climate context, and like I said, I won't go into the details on this, but as Laurent mentioned, you can't, in this context, environment and trade come very close together. So Canada represents about 2% of global greenhouse gas emissions. As a steel sector, in Canada's emissions, we represent about 16 million tons, and Canadian members represent 2% of Canada's GHG emissions. All our mills are in the top 15 industrial emitters. That is a big number, and that is why this the steps Canada is taking and the industry is taking are very important. Canada has committed, along with other countries, to be net zero by 2050. And we just got out of a federal election where the need to combat climate change was reinforced throughout the campaigns. Just to give you a broader scope on where the climate change framework is, there are 4 pillars in Canada that are domestically considered: carbon pricing, complementary actions to carbon pricing, clean technology, innovation and jobs, and adaptation, climate resilience. Just to give you an idea where our carbon pricing and regulatory framework is in Canada, we have the highest carbon price. At the moment, it is at $40 a ton. It will be $50 a ton by 2022, and it will increase by $15 a year after 2023. It will go up to $170 a ton by 2030. And the reason I'm bringing this is because the carbon price trajectory is certainly driving the concern of our competitiveness of the industry versus others not facing the same cost burden. So that just gives you a little bit of an idea of the framework. So what have steel producers in Canada, what have we done? It would be no surprise that we are considered one of the greenest steel in the world. There was a benchmark study done by the Global Efficiency Intelligence Group, as well as supported by the Climate Action Network and Blue Green Alliance, that show that both the EAF production and the blast furnace production of steel are some of the greenest in the world. However, in response to changing governmental, market, and civil society expectations, the CSPA released a climate vision back in March 2020, which sets the aspirational goal of all steel producers in Canada to be net zero by 2050. And in this plan, there are 5 key conditions to achieve net zero. And one of them is the idea to explore border and carbon adjustment. So I think it sets the stage on where we're at as an industry. As Constanza mentioned, we are in the early stages in Canada to have a consultation and discussion around border carbon adjustments. The consultation was launched in August and conversations are happening at the moment. And the EIT sector is engaging with governments on opportunities and concerns related to the BCA. This is also after some analysis of the EU framework, seeing how the US bill has been put. So we have been considering the role BCAs can play in the context of Canada's multi-faceted climate plan. And what I'll be sharing next with you are some of the high principles for the WTO and business consideration when we're trying to develop a carbon border adjustment, not only for Canada, but when we're having the discussion on either a multilateral, plurilateral framework. So what would, from a sector that's emission intensive, what would a BCA look like, or what we would like to see? The BCA should play a smooth, manageable, and competitive transition of our sectors to a net zero economy. That said, we see the BCA as distinct from the carbon pricing regime. It is our view that domestic policy drives carbon reduction within the country, and a BCA does level the playing field with imports to avoid carbon leakage. I think this is an important point to stress. I did mention the high level of carbon price that Canada is facing, and the level of stringency we have is a critical policy instrument to protect the competitiveness of the sector. Our stringency levels should be maintained within the country. And again, the BCA must not be viewed as a management tool on domestic production. It should be viewed as leveling the playing field with imports coming in. Another very important point that we did talk about is the BCA shouldn't restrict trade. I think this is an important part to be said. It shouldn't be seen as a protectionist or a trade measure. It is really to level the playing field on a regulatory basis with imports coming in. We need to work in lockstep with major trading partners and other countries who are exploring this. And we need to continue having that conversation. A couple of other points quickly that I would like to address when it comes to what we would like to see is one of the things we are concerned about is market distortions within supply chains and between products when we're looking at the application and the framework of a BCA. And I'll give you an example to clarify this point we're making. If the BCA is applied to one material, let's say metals, and yeah, I'm gonna pick on my chemistry friend here and not on chemistry or cement or whatever, it will create market distortion. Or if it is applied on one feedstock versus another, this also can create market distortion. So I think where we're talking about is the supply chain and the choice between products should be very well considered. The other point I believe that was made was the BCA should be made to support EIT decarbonization through revenue recycling. It shouldn't be made from a general tax revenue. We should consider the purpose on why this is being imposed. A lot of what we're seeing in the discussion is complexity. However, a BCA should be simple in its application. When we become a little too complex, we lose the feasibility of the application. So simplicity of the framework should be applied. And another key point is it should be WTO consistent. Talking about the WTO, I did mention the forum and the role the WTO can play. I believe climate change is the biggest and most complex environmental issue to be encountered by the WTO. It has a lot of complexities and it doesn't necessarily, it's an envelope that brings the environment and trade together, correct? So the WTO needs to be part of this solution. If we can do it on a multilateral framework and adopt a BCA multilaterally, that would be great. However, a plurilateral approach, a coalition of the willing to discuss the solutions, the barriers, the opportunities, is to be considered too. Identifying the opportunities and the barriers is a key point here. And if there needs to be change on the way some of the rules are structured, I think that conversation should be had as well. I think this, again, this is a new topic. We have discussed it a little bit, but I think collaboration with industries and business groups and other stakeholders like we're having right now is an important part to drive the conversation. So I'll just stop my my comments here. Just to summarize just one key point I would like to stress again is let's not lose sight of what the BCA is supposed to do. The BCA isn't implemented to drive domestic policy on climate, it's to drive to ensure competitiveness and level the playing field. So again, thank you very much. And I'm happy to participate in any questions or conversations to be had.
Thank you, Alec. And for the sake of time, as moderator, I'm going to mix up probably my questions to the ones that have been already raised here. There's one more comment and there's one question that I would like you to reply also together with my questions. Is linked to the retaliation. So most of the critics of the CBAM point out to the increased risk of trade retaliation in response to border carbon adjustment. So how to avoid a conflict escalation leading up to a major trade dispute at the difficult time for the WTO dispute settlement we all have been accompanying. So what are the types of coordination or oversight that could be pursued? And this leads me to another complement to this question that I would like you to raise. There's been different discussions on what is the right forum. So I think it's inevitable, some sort of measure that needs to tackle the carbon leakage. This is a problem that needs to be recognized. What exactly is the type of measure? I think we are at the early stage of discussions and we're looking into concrete proposals from the EU. Probably in the next month, we'll see from other countries more concrete elements on the type of measures. But one of the quick critical aspects that we need to look at, one are the side effects. So what can this trigger? And on the other side, what is the right forum to discuss? So we have seen intentions or mentions at the OECD level to some sort of embrace the type of discussions. We've also witnessed some concerns from countries at the WTO committees, and also some proposals from some countries to sort of create some sort of work group discussions, even mentioned to this at the ministerial by the end of the year. So I would like to hear from you these two aspects in terms of the counter side effects, in terms of retaliation, and also the right forum to bring this. And please feel free for those of you that have an interest to reply to these questions. Please, Laurent.
Thank you, Constanza. Well, for MEDEF, this time wearing the French business hat, MEDEF is broadly favorable to CBAM, but would indeed expect it to not be used, as I mentioned in my own comments, into a protectionist instrument. So it needs to be broadly consulted. So from that perspective, it's good that it is limited to a few sectors. Hopefully that those sectors which are in the final package will be sectors which, from a new perspective, are those which are willing to do that, as opposed to those on which it is imposed. It is good to be trialing. The EU is going to be trialing. And I think more importantly, also to mitigate this risk of retaliation, it is important that the discussion occurs at WTO in terms of the forum, to answer your question. OECD has tried, I don't know where they are, but I think the one area, the one place where it should be discussing, and that's why we're talking at WTO public forum and not the OECD public forum, is the WTO, to ensure that, for instance, if you go into the detail of how it's going to work, the default values are going to be applied, that they're not supposed to be discriminatory, that in fact, the way you assess the carbon footprint of a given product has to be, I don't know, harmonized, but at least coordinated amongst countries which have the same sort of schemes. And then when you assess for those goods which are subject to it, when you assess basically the carbon tax, there should be a deduction from the tax that is levied if there's already a carbon pricing system in the country of origin. Otherwise, basically the importer pays twice. Or let's say the import into the EU pays twice, one at the EU border and the second at home, or the other way around, actually. So this scheme clearly has major trade policy implications that need to be worked out. The EU, I think, is going progressively, and it's a good thing. The EU shouldn't be rushing into an all-encompassing scheme without a trial period, etc. The beauty of EU decision-making process is that it's slow. And because it's slow, I hope it affords opportunity for consultation with trading partners, as Bilal mentioned, with Turkey, for instance, or with Canada, with the United States, with all the trading partners of the EU, to make this a virtuous scheme rather than an obstacle to trade.
Thank you, Laurent. Someone else wants to comment on this? Ali, please.
I'll just jump in. I do agree with Laurent's, and as I mentioned, Laurent's comments, and as I mentioned in my comments, there is an important role the WTO needs to play in the solution. This might be very black or white, what I'm about to say, but if everybody had the same regulatory framework and the same carbon price, there would be no need for a border carbon adjustment, right? So I do think that the WTO has a role to play, but COP also has a role to play. And where we see the difference between the two is one is to ensure the domestic drive is there, and the other one is to ensure that the rules are in place, there's no trade wars, it's not used as a protectionist measure, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think it's a lot more complex conversation to be had amongst forums, and without forgetting the role each would play in the development of a broader plan.
Thank you, Alec. Jörg?
Yeah, I fully agree with my colleagues, but at the end of the day, the problem of retaliation and all this will further exist as long as we are limiting the carbon border adjustment on a certain region. Yeah, and we had to make the group of countries which will create a border adjustment. We have to make the group as big as possible. Yeah, this is a discussion we have just started in Germany, and the idea of a climate club, yeah, is discussed. Which means nothing else than we have to look for other countries in the world, especially, of course, the countries which we are in competition with our industry, to bring these countries together to create a unique climate protection system. Yeah, the same rules for all, the same CO2 price for all. Yeah, and in this group, you can, of course, and you only apply the carbon border at the borders of this group of countries. That's the only idea we have at the moment. Otherwise, you will not get rid of this problem of retaliation risk and all these things. Yeah? Of course, there are some measures discussed already in the European system to reduce this risk. For example, to give the opportunity for the importers into Europe, to give them the opportunity to calculate all the costs they have at home already. Yeah, to reduce the tax and all these things. But at the end of the day, you cannot solve the problem. The only solution of the problem is to make the group of countries big enough with the same rules, the same system, the same CO2 price. Yeah, and you do not need any carbon border adjustment between these countries in the club. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Jörg. Just being a moderator, it's complex, but being a virtual moderator is even more complex because I'm dealing with the two platforms where we are receiving the questions. So I was just looking into there. We have received some comments that I'm going to read from participants, and probably I'm going to put a question in. So I think it's Ingrid that is mentioning that from the EU angle, CBAM will not restrict trade and does not address a level playing field concern. It's just a pure climate measure. That retaliation is not likely an outcome. It needs to be delivered by the WTO dispute settlement first, and that EU CBAM is carefully designed to be WTO compatible and non-discriminatory, so that the EU remains engaged on this issue with different partners at different levels. And I think this is one of the things that we need to recognize, even though this measure creates a lot of challenges because it's extremely complex. In a certain way, the EU has been very open and has, in a certain way, put all the elements to start this discussion in the best way. I think it's, from my point of view, it's a little bit too early to determine there are many things that will happen yet and still needs to be designed. The parliament will have its process at the EU level, the member states, and several things are not defined yet. But I think one of the quick concerns that did lead me to a question that I wanted to raise with you is linked to this WTO compatibility. Is not to have a clear answer to that yet. It's not possible. But of course, there are legitimate concerns in terms of compatibility, because when I was listening to Bill efforts mentioning on the logistics and the companies' efforts that are doing, we see that one of the concerns that currently third countries, companies and countries have is that all the efforts that are being done to decarbonize, not necessarily are going to be considered within the system. So probably you would end up paying or having a burden, a cost beyond that, even if your product is less polluting than the one at the EU level. So there's things that need to be carefully looked at in terms of potential discriminatory effects, either MFN, whether it would be a border measure, whether it would be an internal regulation with some reserves on that. So there are plenty of WTO legal aspects to be seen there. But this leads me to a question that I wanted to raise with you were mentioning about looking from the EU perspective and private sector in terms of the export side. And we've also seen that this is one of the elements that with no doubt will create problems in terms of subsidies and WTO compatibility. So my question to you are two. One is, if there are other ways in which you as a sector and with similar sectors that have the similar concern are trying to address this in terms of demands to the EU, and also try to understand how this process is going within the EU legislative process for your sector. So what are the options, the things that you are interacting currently with EU relevant stakeholders?
Yeah, for the moment, there is no discussion on the European sector to solve this problem. That's really a problem, because the only answer of the EU Commission is that it's not possible to make any compensation for exports to solve this export problem, because it's not WTO compatible. Yeah, stop, full stop. Huh? And a solution, of course, could be to create a system of CBAMs not with the basic materials like steel or chemicals or something else, but to create a system with the end products. But to create a system with the end products, it's much more complex. Yeah. At the end of the day, what is the CO2 content of a car or a mobile phone or refrigerator or something else? No? That's a problem. To create a system for the end products would solve these problems for the intermediates to export. Yeah, but yeah, for the moment we have no solution for this problem.
So thank you, Jörg. I've been advised that we have 3 minutes to wrap up our session. So just for sake, I think it's the very early beginning of several discussions that we should be having either at GBC level, but also in this type of forums that would help us. I think it's been extremely rich, not only to look into the nitty-gritty of the legal aspects, but also to look in how this impacts into a daily basis to business, either from the EU, from third countries. And I think that we should be looking more into details of this. One of the last comments that I wanted to mention that we won't be able to tackle today, but there have been already material published in terms of principles and best practices that the design of this type of measures should have. I think this is extremely relevant content to deep in for business and government, so that we look into the primacy of the leakage protection, carbon, revenue sharing, the credit for equivalence, openness, non-double protection, several aspects that should be taken into consideration when designing this type of measures. And I hope that we as business will have more opportunities to do our job with our national governments, but also at the international level, to bring more cooperation either at the WTO and other forums to move forward. I think this is a very initial stage of these discussions, and we will see much more discussions within this topic. I wanted to thank you all for your time, for your participation, and we look forward for more discussions in this issue.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Muito obrigado.
Bye-bye.
Bye.